Good to be with you again tonight. We've been talking about character traits on Sunday evenings. And if my voice tonight is any indication, it probably will not be as long as last week, which I think is the longest sermon I've preached since I've been here. So we'll go a little more short, hopefully, tonight. One thing I want to mention as we get started, we just had Jeff had announced it this morning, we just had a meeting with elders and deacons just to talk about the work of the church here. And it's one of those that I wish all of you could have sat in because it's just very encouraging to be reminded of all of the good work that's happening here. I'm so appreciative of the leadership of this church, our elders and deacons and ministry staff, and all of the work that goes on here. And it's neat to be reminded by our deacons some of what they do. It's one of those jobs that when it's done well, you almost don't notice it being done. It just kind of happens. And we have a lot of deacons that kind of work that way, which is encouraging and good and just a really great thing about this church. I will tell you, along with that, the reminder of all of that was also a reminder of just how much work is going on. And so if you are approached by some of those deacons or elders about getting plugged in somewhere and doing something, the answer is yes. And just figure out where it is you need to go and what you need to do, because there is plenty to be done. Even just, you may not think about, just our Sundays together here, Bart reminded us that 27 people are involved every week in the services that happen here, either up front and serving or doing things in the back or whatever. And so if you think of that in a 4-week month, that's 108 people doing something, assuming it's different people every time. I know we have some repetition too, but that's a lot of folks doing stuff, and that's just the worship service. We do a lot of things besides that. So I hope you'll get involved if you're not involved and find ways to be plugged in and to do things to help out with that. Also, if you're called on to do something, I hope, unlike me, oftentimes you'll remember. I tend to forget. I was telling a story in the meeting about a time when I was a youth minister, and I was standing at the end of a Sunday evening service waiting for the closing prayer to happen, and I finally looked at my wife and I said, "Where is the person supposed to be doing this?" And she looks at me and said, "It's you." And so I ran up and did it. Anyhow, we're going to be looking tonight at gentleness. Now, I have to admit to you, because of what we talked about with eagerness and all of those things this morning, I really wanted to do something along the lines of kind of get to it, get things done, be excited about it, diligence. And I realize I've already done diligence, and I realize that I have already done kind of getting things started, getting things going. I can't think of the word for it right now. But I've done a lot of those things. So I thought, what else within what we looked at this morning in Ephesians 4 is there? And gentleness just kind of jumped out at me. So we're going to look at gentleness tonight. And as we look at the definition, we're going to cheat just a little bit and look at the definition of gentle. Because if you look at the definition of gentleness, it's something like the state of being gentle, which is no good. So that doesn't help us. So we'll look at gentle. Free from harshness, sternness, or violence. I think that's probably what we prefer to encounter most of the time. Something that is not harsh or stern or violent against us. And then Webster went into kind of this series of synonyms, which I kind of like. First of all, chivalrous. We don't use that one a lot nowadays. We tend to think of that in King Arthur's day and time and knights and all of that stuff. But chivalry is one of those things that is probably appreciated in our world. When we have several times we'll come here and we'll have some of our young men out there holding doors as we come in, and I'm appreciative of the chivalry that is still going on. We see that in our lives from time to time. Third, kind and amiable. So as we talked about kindness this morning in Bible class, if you were in the auditorium, there is a piece of gentleness that is very related to kindness. And then fourth, soft and delicate. And I think this can be a good thing and a bad thing for us. We taught our boys from the point they were small that girls are delicate flowers. Now, that's almost a bad thing to say in our culture nowadays because everybody's equal and all, I get all that. But we were trying basically to teach them don't hit girls. And so we went with girls are a delicate flower. When we think of soft and delicate, we tend to put that alongside weak. And because of that, I think when we think gentleness a lot of times, we think weakness. I don't think Scripture teaches about gentleness in that way. Scripture looks at gentleness in a very positive way that is not necessarily weakness. So what does Scripture say about gentleness? And we'll look a little more at how it relates to weakness also. First of all, gentleness is not the same as weakness. It's not the same thing. And if you came in tonight thinking that, and you think, okay, when I hear gentle, what I hear is weak, break yourself of that. If we accomplish nothing else tonight, Gentle is a good thing. Gentle is something that even the toughest among us should be trying to do, trying to be. It's not weakness. So as we look in Proverbs a couple places, first in chapter 15 and verse 1, it says that a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. And then in chapter 25 and verse 15, with patience, a ruler may be persuaded, and a soft tongue will break a bone. So you see in both of these cases the word soft used. But what soft is used for is not to describe something that's weak. It's to describe an action of power. The idea that a soft tongue breaks a bone, that is an action of power, not an action of weakness. The idea that the soft can be persuasive is not an action of weakness, it's an action of power. Softness in this case can be both persuasive and effective. And I think we see a lot of times in our world that people misuse power as always this idea of harshness, always this idea of being above someone else, and don't see that there's a piece of that where gentleness can actually be persuasive, effective, something that you want to do that will be helpful in getting the thing done that needs to be done. So gentleness, weakness, not the same thing. We also see in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 and 4, do not let your adorning be external. He's talking here to wives, but I think we can see a bigger truth going on here. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. So we see that it's persuasive and that it's effective, but we also see that it's imperishable. It's something that goes on, and it's something that is of value. So gentleness is not something that should be looked down on. Gentleness is not something that we should assume is weak. It's something that is valued by God. It's one of those pieces of the fruit of the Spirit that we're going to talk about in Sunday morning class a couple weeks from now. Gentleness is there at the core of who we are to be as spiritual beings. In James chapter 3, James says, but the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy, good fruits, impartial, and sincere. And so here in the midst of all these positive things, we see that gentleness is part of wisdom. There is a wisdom involved in knowing when to be gentle, and not just when to be gentle, but how gentleness is important to who we are. Should not be something we have to convince ourselves of, something that we have to say that we're going to give up and be gentle. Gentleness is part of the wise person's existence. Because also, gentleness is not only not weakness, it's actually strength. Christians are called to have gentleness. In Colossians chapter 3, in verse 12, it says, so as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. So we are to put these things on, almost as we're getting ready for our day. We put this on with the other things that we do. And then in Ephesians chapter 4 that we read this morning, it says that we are to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which we have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love. So part of the walking, part of that daily life in this manner, is to walk in gentleness. And then, there we go. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul says, but as for you, O man of God, flee these things. He's talking about all the negatives before. Right before that, we have money being the root of evil and all of those things. But to pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, steadfastness, and gentleness. So we talked this morning about what are you eager for? What are you striving for? What are you diligent about, making every effort toward? Here Paul says, pursue this. I don't know when the last time is that you chased something. We don't do that an awful lot. But usually you don't chase something unless there's a desperation or an importance involved. Paul says these are things you are to pursue. And in the midst of them all is gentleness. When we correct others, which we like to do from time to time, it should also be done in gentleness. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1, Paul says, brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. When we go to correct someone, when we go to point out something that someone is doing wrong, first of all, I think Jesus encourages us in the Sermon on the Mount, take a good look, hard look at yourself first and figure out where we're falling short. But then when we have to do this, what is the spirit in which we do it? Is it an I told you so spirit? Is it a how could you have made that mistake again kind of spirit? Or is it a spirit of gentleness? Because when you're on the other side of that, which one do you accept more easily? Do you accept the one that is harsh in tone? Do you accept the one that makes you feel smaller than you are? Or do you accept that gentle spirit in a way that actually helps you to be corrected? We're in 2 Timothy chapter 2. And the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but be kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. Now, I like the word that Paul chooses to use here, this idea of your opponents, because usually when you think of opponents or enemies or something like that, the interaction, gentleness is not one of the things you think of, is it? It's about a time of strength. I've read books about people who will talk about the way they set up their office to try to communicate what they want to communicate or to make sure they remain in a position of power. And so there are actually people who will make sure that the desk chair that they sit in sits higher than the guest chairs that are on the other side of the desk. Now, I will tell you honestly, I have no idea in my office. It was all there when I got here. So maybe it was like that. I'll blame Floyd if it is. But, people like to have this position of power where they're above. Paul says instead, when you have opponents, to come in with gentleness. Because people don't expect that, do they? That's not how our world works. God may perhaps grant them repentance, leading to a knowledge of the truth. As you think of Jonah as he goes in to preach that message, maybe they will actually listen to the message it's being preached. Because after all, isn't that the objective? We want to be able to communicate, be able to convince, persuade, whatever it is. And Paul says, if you do that through gentleness, it's a very different result. When we share the truth, it should also be done in gentleness. And this is another place where we struggle because we're right, aren't we? I mean, we wouldn't be here if we weren't right, would we? We'd be somewhere else doing something else. But we feel like the way we teach, the doctrine we have, is correct. And when you're correct about something, don't you tend to be a little overconfident in the way you present it? Or don't you tend maybe to be a little bit above, a little bit overly knowledgeable, whatever it may be, to make it seem as if you were at a higher spot and the person you're talking with is at a lower place? I watch football games every Saturday, and even though I have never played football at a very high level, I know exactly what they're doing wrong. And I could tell you, and I could tell the coaches what they need to change to fix this and make it right. We tend to operate this way in a lot of things. When we drive down the road, we know exactly why the other driver is not driving correctly and what they need to do differently. When we're in the store, we know how people should go through the store. When they have rearranged our store, we know why they've rearranged it in the wrong way. Anything you think of, we have a way it should be done and a way that it shouldn't. And when it comes to church things, we're kind of the same way. And so we know we're correct, and it's easy for us to go into it with that kind of attitude. But Paul says, even if you're correct, as you share the gospel, to do this in the right way. And Peter, not Paul, here in 1 Peter chapter 3 says this, in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. And even though he uses the word defense here, which tends to put us kind of in that military strategic kind of mindset, he then says this, yet do it with gentleness and respect. How many times when we have a true disagreement with somebody, do we also have enough respect for that person to treat them with gentleness? And put it in whatever arena you need to put it in, whether it's discussions of things spiritual or things political or things of the world or whatever it may be. So often when we disagree, respect and gentleness tend to go out the window with that. And Peter here says, gentle in the way that you say these things. Gentle in the way you approach it, because the truth you have is so important, you don't want to undo it with the way in which you say it. Our gentleness should be clear to everyone. And that's tough, by the way, because you can't exactly toot the horn of your own gentleness, can you? You can't go out and say, look at how gentle I am. Everyone see this as an example. It's all in how you do things. And much like, as I talked about at the beginning, the deacons and the work that they do, when those things are happening smoothly, you almost kind of forget they're there. When we're acting in gentleness, it's not always easy for people to notice. But because of the world we live in, it is most definitely a contrast. In Titus chapter 3, Paul says, remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work, to speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, and to show perfect courtesy toward all people. And everything he describes here in these first couple verses is kind of everything the world tends not to be, isn't it? Now, from time to time, it may be some of the things we tend not to be too. We may struggle here. But our world is not a lot of these things. And so Paul says to Titus, do these things. Remind the church to be these things. In Ephesians chapter 4, where we'll get to in a couple weeks on Sunday mornings, he says to be kind to one another, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you. This kindness, forgiving, gentleness that we have not just to the world around us, but also with each other. So the world should see in the way that we treat each other that there is a gentle spirit at work here. And then in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 5, let your gentleness, this is the NIV, I like the way it's worded here, let your gentleness be evident to all, the Lord is near. Let your gentleness be evident to all. And because it's not as obvious, because it's not one of those things that people immediately pick out, you really have to be over the top gentle for this to get through. And so let your gentleness be evident to all. And I think we see all this largely because Jesus is gentle. Jesus is described as meek and gentle and lowly and humble. It's all part of who he is, but a couple places we'll look at it and then some examples. In Matthew chapter 11 and verse 28, Jesus describing himself says this, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And if you are not here right now as we sit here on Sunday evening, you have been here at some point, or you will be here in the near future. Do you ever feel like you labor or weary, as one of the versions puts it, and are heavy laden? Do you ever feel like you're just all this stuff bearing down on you? I felt like I was busy already. Yeah, I preach and I do the thing. Little do you know, I do work on days that are not Sunday. I do the things here. I'm working on the doctoral stuff that I've told you about. Now I've added this piece to it that is the stuff has to be cleaned out of my mom's apartment as she has moved to a new place. And so it's finding times to do all these various things. And sometimes I just feel kind of weary. In the midst of all of that, wherever it came from, someone thought, hey, sinus infection. This would be a great time for that. And so now it's where your voice hold out through all these things, and can you stop coughing, and all of this stuff going on. I will tell you, when I read this verse tonight, I think, yeah, come to me, you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. Jesus does not come to us with an I told you so. Jesus does not come to you with the spirit of, I have lived the life you are living, except I did it perfectly, and man, you should have done it that way too. Jesus comes to you with, I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Rest, so important to him, by the way, that the one who is there at the beginning and has been there living with God throughout all eternity, one of the commandments is Sabbath. These people are going to be so bad at resting, let's command it. Let's make sure they have to rest at least one day. And by the way, we get to New Testament days, we have left that one far behind, haven't we? We have a hard time with Sabbath. But Jesus says, I will give you rest. I'm gentle. And then Paul describes him this way in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. I, Paul, myself, entreat you, not by the power, not by the resurrection, although he'll talk about that at other times. I entreat you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. I, who am humble when face to face with you, but bold toward you when I am away. I come to you in the gentleness. And I will tell you, when I look at Paul, gentle is not always the first thing that comes to mind. Paul seems pretty bold. He seems brave. He seems willing to die for what he believes in. But even in the midst of all that, Paul recognizes the value of gentleness. So we will look at the obvious biblical example of gentleness, Jesus. And rather than one story, as we've been doing quite a bit through this, we're going to look at four different ones, three pretty short ones, one a little bit longer. I'm going to get a drink of water so I can survive. Give me just a second. If you want to be turning to the book of Mark, I believe at the beginning, chapter 1. The first one we will look at is an encounter of Jesus and the leper. In Mark chapter 1, I believe beginning in verse 40. Yeah. A leper came to him. A leper came to him, imploring him and kneeling, and said to him, if you will, make me clean. Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I will, be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. Now, I like the way Jesus does miracles for a number of reasons, and you're probably the same way, where you see miracles and you pick out little things about it. The thing I really love in this miracle is the gentleness that Jesus shows in touch. If you could imagine the life of a leper, I was thinking about this today. When COVID is going on, is not the ideal time to have a sinus infection because everyone begins to wonder, how close can we get to Brian right now? And is that safe for me? And all of that. And I think it's a small piece of what it must have been like. What would it be like to be a leper in this day and time? Have to announce as you're coming forward so people could clear a path, but that no one ever touches. You guys are huggers, I have learned over the course of time. I am not a hugger by nature, I have to admit this to you. I have learned a little bit. I'm still not always there. But there is that need for physical touch. And even the non-huggers among us, there are a lot of handshakers and everything else. We have these physical interactions that we have. To go just year after year after year with none of that. And Jesus could have, like everyone else, kept his distance, but he touches him. The gentleness that is shown in that, the caring that is shown in that. Secondly, the woman with the issue of blood in Mark chapter 5. Jesus is going along, and we know this. I'll kind of do a synopsis of it so I don't have to read the whole thing. Jesus is going along, he's going through a crowd, and there's this woman with the issue of bleeding, which, there is all kinds of commentary about what this means or doesn't mean. It is most likely some sort of a female issue, which in their day and time is more than just the unpleasantness of it. It is more than just the difficulty of it. It is also the ceremonially unclean of it. You can't go into the temple with this. You can't be around people with this. And because of that, even though she is not a leper, she might as well be, because she's living out the same kind of existence. And she wants to come into contact with Jesus, but at the same time, she can't. It's not even just will I be brave enough to go and ask him? She, because of the laws of the temple and the laws of the synagogue, she cannot come into contact with Jesus. And so her plan is this: I will camouflage myself as best as I can. And if I can just get to the edge of his garment, that's all I need. There's so much power in this man. If I can just contact the garment, I think something will happen. You imagine the amount of faith that goes into that. We all have the things of, if we could sit with Jesus for a day and ask him these questions or whatever, we'd want to do that. What kind of faith would it take that if you actually could see Jesus today, you're not even looking for the question answered or him to come and lay hands on you and do whatever. It's, if I could just make contact with the edge of the robe, then everything will be okay. And so that's her plan, and she comes along. And I think partially because of the unclean and partially all of the ceremonial things, and partially probably because the last thing she wants is to be noticed. She just wants this to be an in and out kind of thing and everything done. And the last thing in the world she expects is the moment where she touches the hem of the garment for him to say, hang on a second, I felt something just then. In the comedy of this whole situation, by the way, as you're pressed in with this crowd all around you, it's just people. You ever try to get in and out of some place where there's a big crowd? If you're a Black Friday shopper, I pray for you. If you're a Black Friday shopper, if you go to Disney World, if you go to a college football game, wherever it is, and you're trying to get through an exit that wasn't designed for that many people, and you just feel like all of your space it's not okay. This crowd is pressing in, and Jesus says, who touched me? And I know all of the apostles, I don't know if they rolled eyes back in 2,000 years ago in the Middle East, but if they did, somebody had to. So there had to be at least one eye roller in the crowd. There had to be one sigh in there, and one, who didn't touch you? Literally, everybody. It's a crowd. But he calls to attention this moment. And we'll skip ahead here a little bit because I had the whole story in here. He says, who touched you? They say, you've got this crowd pressing around. And he looks around to see who did it. But the woman, knowing what had happened, she has already felt something. She knows something's different. Came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And this whole plan, if I could just touch the other's garment, everything will be okay. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. And so he gives to her a gentle word. She has the touch of the garment, which is a little different than the touch the leper gets. But to her, it's gone beyond embarrassment now because she didn't want to be noticed. But what he's done for her is something she didn't even realize she needed. Because for her to be healed is one thing, but everyone knows she's unclean. She's had this for years and it's a small town. People know. People know something's going on. People know why she's not at the temple. People know why she's not around. And now he has announced this whole crowd who's there that will now begin to spread this news because that's what small towns do. She's okay now. She's clean. And the gentleness of spirit that goes into that announcement. Thirdly, the children in Mark chapter 10 and verse 13. We love kids around here. I will mention from time to time, partly because I want to remind all of us, partly because I want to remind all the moms and dads that are struggling with kids, that you so much more want these sounds than not having these sounds. We love the idea of kids here. Kids in their day and time, it was different. They were in the way. And maybe some places in our society feel that way too. But in their day and time, kids were kind of in the way. And so when all these kids are coming around, the disciples are trying to keep them from getting to Jesus. They don't want to waste Jesus' time with this. And so it says they're bringing children to him that they might touch him in Mark 10. And the disciples rebuke them. Stop bringing your kids around here. And Jesus saw it, and he was indignant. But not indignant with the kids like everybody else would be. He's indignant with the adults that dare keep the kids away. He's indignant with the ones who say, this is too much. We don't want all this distraction and all of it. He's indignant with them, and he says, let the little children come to me. Do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of God. Truly I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child shall not enter it. And he took them in his arms and blessed them, laying his hands on them. He gives to them this gentle blessing. And I will have you note, by the way, as you read through the Gospels, and I hope you do that with some frequency, look at the number of times that Jesus blesses people. Now, I know he's a blessing to people. I know the things that he does bless their lives and all that. But the number of times that what the gospel writers detail is Jesus blessing someone, there's not a lot of that. There's a lot of Jesus healing, a lot of Jesus teaching, a lot of Jesus doing miraculous things and all of that. There's not a lot of detail of Jesus blessing someone. But here, he blesses the ones that everyone else wants to ignore. He blesses the people that no one else would bother taking the time with. And then fourth, one that's really familiar to us, the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8. In John chapter 8, starting in verse 3, it says, the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. If you think the woman, back from the story of this woman with the issue of blood in Mark 5, if you think she doesn't want to be noticed, this woman most definitely doesn't want to be noticed. So this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. She's been dragged out from wherever she was, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. I cannot begin to imagine all of the emotions going through this woman's mind. There's a piece of embarrassment, I'm sure, just because of whatever state of dress or undress you're in, of being dragged out there and accused and all of that. But I would imagine the embarrassment kind of dies down a little bit when you realize because of their law and because of where they live, your life is not much longer. Because she has seen how this story ends. So her thought is, this is it for me. And so they brought this woman out to Jesus thinking we're going to trap Jesus here. But they don't get the result they're looking for. Much like the disciples with the children, the indignance is not coming in the direction they're expecting. So now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say? Right? Jesus, here's the right answer. What's your answer? And so Jesus does something very unusual. It says they said this to test him, that they may have some charge to bring against him. And Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. I've already given you the scenario of if Jesus were here and you'd ask him questions. This has always been one of mine. What are you writing on the ground? Everybody's got a theory, by the way. I think we talked about this when we preached through John. There are people who think that he is, and I don't know if any of these are true, by the way. Maybe one of them is, but who knows. There are people that think he is listing out recent sins of the people who have brought this woman out there. He's writing them down big enough where they can see it from where they stand. There are those who think he is writing the name of the man caught in adultery that for whatever reason is not here. Kind of like that idea too. There are people that think he's just drawing or doing whatever. Who knows? I think whatever he's writing, and this is my personal opinion, whatever he's writing is giving everyone the opportunity to cool down a little bit. Because when you're with an angry crowd, it is hard to calm them people down. They're all so much centered on this is where we're going, this is what we're doing, and he's forcing them to take a breath, if for no other reason, for they now have to ask each other, why is he drawing on the ground? What's going on here? And so he kneels down to write on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. I'm going to guess they never anticipated this answer. They probably thought it's either going to be a let her go and then we will condemn him for not keeping the law of Moses, or there will be a yes, let's stone her and I'll be a part of that too, and we can condemn him for not being as gentle and merciful and all those things as everyone thinks he is. But instead he says, let him who's without sin cast the first stone at her. And once more, he bends down and writes on the ground. Again, I think giving them a little time, maybe not to cool down here, maybe time to think. Who's going to be the one that would actually do that? But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? And she said, no one, Lord. And Jesus said, neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more. And so he gives to her a gentle reprieve. Her life, by all accounts, should have ended in that moment. Now, don't get me wrong there. I don't like the idea of anybody's life ending for that reason. I'm not suggesting we do anything like that. But based on their law and what they did, and if there were 10 other circumstances just like that in the course of that week and Jesus were not there, they all would have ended in a very different kind of way. And she knew that. And yet, he offers something different to her. And for us, we have that same kind of offer of gentleness from Jesus. The gentleness of Jesus is a stark contrast to the world in which he lives. A world in which everything is cut and dry, black and white. Everything is, you have to choose the side here, you have to do this thing in this way. And Jesus offers the opportunity for love to win out over that. Jesus details in the Sermon on the Mount all of these, you have heard that said this. And for the most part, it wasn't just said this, it was written down in the Old Testament this. And Jesus says, but the spirit of that is this. This is what I tell you. This is what you should do. The way Jesus handled people was very, very different. Because the people who brought that woman out before Jesus were the religious leaders of his time. What if, I started tonight by telling you about the elders and deacons meeting that happened beforehand here. What if that group of men dragged someone down front here tonight and told you about the sin they were caught in? What'd you think about that? I would think that would be the weirdest Sunday night service we have ever had. I would be looking at the guys in the back going, cut the stream. We don't want to publish that out on YouTube. How odd would that be? And yet it's weird for us to read in John 8. This is daily life in their world. But what Jesus does is so different than the world in which he lives, even different than what the religious leaders around him did. And the beauty of the story still is, when we live showing this kind of gentleness in the world around us, it is so much contrast to the world in which we live that they can't help but wonder, why are these people like this? And maybe the question for us is, if they're not asking that question, are we being gentle enough? Are we interacting with people in such a gentle kind of way that people see Jesus in what we do instead of just the same judgmental negativity, all of the things that they're used to seeing from everybody else? And I've encountered a lot of both in life. I've encountered a lot of people that would gladly point out to you the thing that you did wrong, where you fell short, what is not good enough, what you need to change. And I probably sometimes needed to hear some of those things. But I have also encountered an awful lot of people in my walk that have walked alongside me, put their arm around my shoulder, and said, I'm concerned about this. And I struggle with this, and I worry about this a little bit in your life. Maybe you struggle there too, and maybe we should work together through some of these things. And I will tell you, do you know which one of those is more convincing in my mind? Which one of those people stands out as, that is the work of God in my life? It is the one who is gentle. It's the reason why when we look through the life of Jesus, the few times we see him acting out in anger, the few times we see him really truly rebuking, the few times we see him, woe to you, Pharisees and hypocrites. It's with the religious leaders that are getting it wrong. It's not with the world around him who are the sick in need of a doctor. With those people, it's gentleness. It's wanting to reach them in a way that they can be reached. So if you're here tonight and you have not heard that message gently somewhere along the way, maybe this is the time for you. I think there is a God who wants to gently draw you into him and wants for you to follow him and to live this kind of life. Or if you have been treated harshly somewhere along the way and that has driven you away from him, he wants to bring you back to him. He loves you so much that he was willing to let his son undergo some of the harshest treatment ever taken on by anybody so that you could be with him. His gentleness stands true even today, and his gentleness calls you to him tonight as we stand and as we sing.